I spent 38 years in insurance reading fine print, assessing risk, figuring out exactly what a policy was worth before the claim ever came in. You develop a certain kind of eye for it. You learn to look past what people tell you and pay attention to what they actually do. You learn that the gap between those two things is where the truth lives. I wish I'd applied that same eye to my own family. My name is Gerald. No, wait, let me start over. That's not even right. My name is Frank. I'm 64 years old, and I lived in a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street in Oakville, Ontario, about 40 minutes west of Toronto on a good day. The kind of neighborhood where people still shovel their neighbor's driveway in February without being asked. I chose that house because it reminded me of where I grew up, and because I thought it was the right kind of place to raise a family that would be worth raising. I did everything by the book. Contributed to my RRSP every year since I was 27. Paid off the house by 51. Put my daughter through university. 4 years at Western, no student loans, because I didn't want her starting her adult life in debt the way I had. When she got married at 29, I paid for the wedding. Not half of it, all of it. $83,000 at a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake, because that's what she wanted and I was her father. And that's what fathers do. Her husband, my son-in-law, is the kind of man who shakes your hand while looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important has walked into the room. I noticed that at the rehearsal dinner. I filed it away the way I used to file claim discrepancies. Noted. Not yet actionable. My wife had passed 8 years earlier. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just me and my daughter. And then it was me and my daughter and the man she married, and then somewhere along the way it became mostly just me. I don't say that to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because you need to understand the arrhythmia of I ended up alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, with no one on the other side of the glass. It started with the cottage. I own a place on Georgian Bay, a proper cottage, not a glorified shed. 3 bedrooms, a dock, a wood stove that actually works. My father built it in 1971, and I've kept it up ever since. Every spring I drive up there alone, open it up, check the roof, run the water, make sure the mice hadn't gotten ambitious over the winter. My daughter and her husband started coming up every August about 5 years ago. At first it was a week. Then it stretched to 3 weeks. Then they started bringing friends. I didn't mind at first. A cottage is meant to be used. But somewhere in year 3, they stopped asking. They'd just send me a text in July. We're thinking the 8th to the 28th this year. Is that okay? And I say yes because she was my daughter and it was her childhood home too, in a way. And because I still believe that if I gave enough, eventually people understood what you were worth. The fees started around the same time. Not fees exactly, that's too formal a word. More like a slow leak. My son-in-law had started a business importing outdoor furniture from overseas. He needed a bridge loan to cover a container that got stuck at the port of Vancouver. Just $18,000, he said. Temporary. He'd have it back to me within 90 days. I remember he looked me in the eye when he said that. I thought that meant something. It meant nothing. The 90 days became 6 months, then a year. When I brought it up at Christmas dinner, my daughter looked at me like I'd knocked over the gravy boat on purpose. Dad, you know how cash flow works? You were in business for 35 years. I let it go. I didn't want to spend Christmas arguing about money. Then there was the car. My son-in-law needed to upgrade his truck for the business, something he could haul samples in. He found a used F-250 he liked, but the financing rate his bank was offering was too high, he said. Could I co-sign? Just a formality. He'd make every payment. I co-signed. He made 8 payments, and then the account went quiet. I found out 6 months later when a collections notice arrived at my house, because of course the billing address on the loan was still mine. By the time I started tracking everything in a spreadsheet, old habit. The number was just over $67,000, not counting the wedding. And through all of it, my daughter's response to any concern I raised was some variation of, "Dad, why do you always have to make things about money?" As if I were the one who'd introduced the subject. I had a fitness exam in October of last year. My GP in Oakville, I've seen the same doctor for 22 years, noticed something irregular in my ECG. She referred me to a cardiologist in Hamilton. The cardiologist was direct with me in the way that good doctors are. When they have bad news, there was significant blockage in my left anterior descending artery. The kind of blockage that earns a nickname. They call it the Widowmaker. He told me I needed a catheterization, possibly a stent, possibly more depending on what they found once they were in. He scheduled me for the second Friday in November. I told my daughter on a Thursday. She said, "Oh no, Dad, that's serious. Do you need me to come?" I said yes, actually. I'd appreciate it, even just for the night before and the morning of, just so I wasn't alone in the waiting room. She said of course. She said she'd be there. Her husband's 40th birthday was the following Saturday. I didn't know until later that they'd been planning the party for 3 months. A dinner at a private room at a restaurant in Yorkville. 40 guests. A tasting menu. A sommelier. My daughter had apparently spent weeks organizing it. I understand it cost somewhere in the range of $12,000, much of which was charged to a credit card that I had helped them open 2 years earlier when their credit score made it impossible to get a reasonable limit on their own. I didn't know any of this going in. I just knew she'd said she'd be there. The procedure was scheduled for 7:30 in the morning. I drove myself to the hospital because I thought she was meeting me there. I checked in. I sat in the preoperative area in one of those gowns that make every man feel about 93 years old. I watched the clock. 7:15, 7:20. The nurse assigned to mine. The nurse assigned to me. A kind woman, young, maybe 30. The sort of person who actually looks you in the eye. Came over to check my vitals. She asked if anyone was coming to be with me. I said yes, my daughter. She must be in traffic. The nurse nodded and wrote something down. They let me hold my phone until they took me back. I texted my daughter at 7:18. They're going to take me in soon. 3 minutes later, just getting ready, we'll call you after. Then another, phone is about to go to the nurses. Nothing. I handed my phone to a nurse at 7:43 and they wheeled me through. I don't remember much of the procedure. You're conscious, but sedated. They call it twilight anesthesia. I remember the cold of the room and someone telling me to breathe normally and the strange intimacy of strangers working on your chest. I remember thinking about my father in the cottage and whether I'd left the heat low enough when I'd closed it up in October. I came out of it about 2 hours later. The cardiologist told me they'd placed 2 stents and the procedure had gone well. I would need to stay overnight for monitoring. He asked if I had someone at home. I said yes. I said my daughter would be there. A nurse offered to call her. I gave her the number. My daughter answered on the 3rd ring. The nurse, I could hear her through the call because the room was quiet, explained that I had just come out of surgery, that everything had gone well, that they'd like to keep me overnight, and someone should be available for discharge the following morning. My daughter said she couldn't come tonight. She said there was a situation with her husband's event and she was right in the middle of it and it was very stressful. She asked the nurse if I was stable. The nurse said yes. My daughter said good. Call her in the morning. And then she said, please don't call again tonight. We're trying to eat. I was 40 feet away, lying in a hospital bed with 2 stents in my heart. And my daughter told the nurse not to call again because they were trying to eat. The nurse came back into my room and she didn't repeat what she'd heard. She didn't have to. Her face said everything a professional face is trained not to say. She adjusted my blanket and asked if I wanted the television on. And I said no thank you. And she left. And I lay there in the dark and thought about 38 years of reading, risk, and how badly, how completely, how almost deliberately I had misread this one. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed in short stretches and woke up each time to the beep of the monitors, and the low sound of the hospital at night, and the particular silence of being a 64-year-old man alone in a room where your family has decided you don't need them. In the morning, they discharged me. A volunteer, a retired man, probably mid-70s, wearing one of those red vests, pushed my wheelchair to the front door and asked if my ride was coming. I told him I'd take a cab. He waited with me without being asked. I didn't catch his name. My daughter arrived at the house that afternoon. She brought a casserole from M&M Food Market. Still frozen, I noticed, which meant she hadn't made it. And she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said she was sorry she couldn't be there. It had just been terrible timing. She knew I understood. Her husband didn't come in. He waited in the car. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, "Of course, I understand." And she looked relieved, and that relief told me everything I still needed to know. She left within the hour. I sat alone in my kitchen with a defrosting casserole, and I made a decision, quietly and completely, the way I used to make decisions about large claims, methodically, without emotion, with great precision. I called my lawyer the following Monday, not a family lawyer, my estate lawyer, a man named, a good man I'd worked with for 11 years. I told him I wanted to make some changes. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. That's what I pay him for. The first thing I did was update my will. My daughter was no longer the primary beneficiary. I redirected the bulk of the estate, the house, the investments, the cottage, to a charitable foundation I established in my wife's name, something she would have wanted. My daughter received a modest bequest, enough to know she'd been considered, not enough to reward what I'd witnessed. The second thing I did was contact the lender on the F-250 and pay out the remaining balance myself. Then I notified them that I was formally withdrawing as co-signer on any future obligations. The truck, my son-in-law's truck, technically, was now entirely his problem. His credit rating would reflect that. The third thing took a little longer. I'd been managing a non-registered investment account that my daughter knew about. She'd always assumed, I think, that it would simply flow to her eventually. I liquidated it over 3 weeks and moved the proceeds into a new account in my name only, linked to a new institution. Then I closed the joint line of credit I'd opened with her years ago, the one that had been sitting mostly unused but available. The $67,000 debt, I wrote it off in my own records. Not forgiven, just acknowledged as the cost of learning something true about a person. It's cheaper than 30 more years of the same. Then I called my daughter and told her I was going to spend a few months at the cottage. I said I needed the quiet for my recovery. She said that sounded lovely. She asked if they could still come up in August. I said I'd be in touch. I drove up to Georgian Bay the last week of November. The road through Barrie was icy, and the sky was that particular gray that means winter isn't coming. It's already here. I turned the wood stove on when I got in. I made tea. I stood at the window and watched the bay, and I thought, I know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a facade. I did not call to say I'd arrived. The calls from my daughters started about 10 days later. First casual, just checking in, how are you feeling? Then more frequent. Then slightly more urgent in tone if not in content. I answered some of them. I kept the conversations short and pleasant and revealed nothing. My son-in-law called once. He left a voicemail that started with, "Hey there, just wanted to touch base." The vocal equivalent of a handshake while looking over your shoulder. I didn't return it. In early December, my estate lawyer contacted me to say the documents were finalized. I signed them remotely. That same week, I had a conversation with the property management company I use for the cottage in winter. I told them that my daughter and her husband were no longer authorized to access the property. I changed the lockbox code on the garage. I had the spare key they'd kept for years, a key I'd given them myself, in what I now understood to be a gesture of trust they had no framework for. Transferred back. My daughter found out about the will through her own lawyer, whom she apparently called after I declined to take 3 calls in a row in January. I don't know exactly what she was told, but I got a message that night that was different from the others. Not casual. Not checking in. Dad, I think we need to talk. I mean really talk. I'm worried. I waited 3 days to respond. Then I wrote, I agree. When you're ready, you know where I am. She drove up to the cottage on a Saturday. It was a kind of February morning that makes you remember why people leave Ontario. Wind off the bay. Temperature around -18 with the chill. She was alone. She sat across from me at the same table where we'd eaten every summer of her childhood, and she looked at me differently than she had in a long time. Not with the easy comfort of someone who assumes they are loved, no matter what. With something more careful. She said she didn't understand what had happened. I asked her to think about the night of November 14th. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. She said the timing had been impossible. There had been so much pressure with the party, she hadn't been thinking clearly. I told her I understood that. I told her I believed her. And then I told her that understanding and believing her didn't change what I'd seen, which was that when the nurse called to say her father had just come out of cardiac surgery, she had asked them not to call back because they were trying to eat. She started to cry, real tears. I know the difference between those two. I let her cry. I made coffee. I sat down again. I said, I'm not punishing you. I want you to understand that. I'm not doing any of this out of anger. I did it because I finally got honest with myself about what our relationship has actually been and what it's going to need to be going forward. I told her I loved her. That was true, and it remained true, and nothing I'd done changed it. I also told her that love was not a blank check, that I had spent 20 years writing checks, financial ones, emotional ones, against an account that was never reciprocated, and that I was 64 years old and had 2 stents in my heart, and the finite amount of time left, and I intended to spend it differently. She asked about the money, about the will. I said the foundation would do good work in her mother's name, and that seemed to me like the right place for it. She asked about the cottage. I said the cottage was mine, and that she was welcome here as a guest, when she was invited, for now. She sat with that for a while. Then she asked what she needed to do. I said I didn't have a list. I said the only thing I could tell her was that the version of this relationship that had existed before November 14th was done. If there was going to be a new one, it would have to be built differently, slower, on what was actually there, not what we'd both been pretending was there. She left that afternoon. I watched their car back out of the drive and disappear through the birch trees. I stood at the window and watched the bay until it got too dark to see it. I don't know how this ends. I'm not sure I'm supposed to know yet. She's called twice since that day, and both calls were different from the ones before. Shorter, more careful, less assumption in her voice. Whether that means something is changing or whether it's just a new strategy, I genuinely can't tell. I spent 38 years reading risk, and I still can't always tell. What I can tell you is this. The night I lay in that hospital bed alone and listened to the monitors beep in the dark, I made myself a promise that I would stop paying for the privilege of being overlooked, that whatever time I have left on this earth, I would spend it among people who actually showed up, not people who called the next day with a frozen casserole and the parking excuse. There is a difference between a person who loves you and the person who loves what you provide. I know that now. I have always known it, actually. I just kept writing it off as someone else's claim. Not anymore. The wood stove is going. The bay is frozen past the dock. In the spring, I'm going to open this place up the way I always have. Check the roof, run the water, see what the winter left behind. For the first time in a long time, I'm going to enjoy doing it alone.